Their persons, Dr. C. Manmohan, Dr. Shivanand Roy, Dr. Rabindranath Chakrabarti, Dr. Anil Mishra, Dr. C.K. Hajra, Dr. Devdas Bhattacharya, Dr. Aftab Khan, and Dr. Manish Kapoor to join this session and take this forward. Session number 10, many issues are not covered in this webinar.
Thank you. We are nearly 50 minutes late. We are sorry about it. It will be an injustice to the last session, but then don't worry, we are all here to hear you. My request will be to confine yourself to a 10 minutes time so that we can have some semblance of a discussion for 2 minutes. So may I have the pleasure to invite Trida Das to talk about the importance of echo in device implantation. I hope he's around.
The speaker has changed to Dr. Amitabh Chatterjee.
Okay.
So the last program, it has been changed to Dr. Amitabh Chatterjee.
But then the topic remains same there?
Topic same, topic same.
Okay. So let us have him then.
Dr. Chatterjee, please.
Good evening, sir. Good evening, sir. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Sure. Go ahead.
Respected Chairperson and all my seniors, thank you for this opportunity. And I would like to begin this session with an obituary to my colleague, Dr. Jitrapati Das's father, who passed away last week due to COVID. So I'm here for the session in lieu of him. We really wish that he rests in peace. I'll start my talk with echo-guided intervention. So what are the natural forms? I mean, what are the usual things where we do the intervention with an echo guidance? The easier ones, there is a normal ones which you like to take in accordance of importance. Is the first one is a pericardial tamponade. So whenever a patient comes with pericardial tamponade in the hospital, everyone is on the toes. And here is an example of a tamponade where we're getting this is a neonate, which is a preterm neonate we were called to having cyanosis. And as you can see, the atrial wall is being crushed. So we have to go inside with a needle, and obviously the journey of the needle is guided somewhat by the echocardiogram. So the echocardiographer usually stands on the other side of the patient, that's on the left side, and the right-handed operator usually goes through the apical pouch, whereby the needle can be guided. If the needle at all goes inside the heart accidentally, then there are several theories which can be put forward, and the life of the patient can be saved. So this is a second example. This is a balloon atrial septostomy, which we often carry on in transposition of great arteries where the oxygen mixture is less. Sorry, oxygen mixture is less, or sorry, there was a change of hand, where the saturation of the patient is much less, and we go for, there are several cases where here you can see an example where the catheter has been put inside the left atrium, and as an echocardiographer we have to see that whether the balloon is safe. It is not inside the left atrial appendage. It is not occluding the SVC or the IVC in particular. It is not occluding the mitral valve in particular, so that the septostomy procedure can be done safely. This is in the same category. This is the same way which is on the angiogram. So this is an ASD device closure assessment. This is a pre-assessment of ASD device closure, which you do routinely. This is a short axis view depicting the retroaortic rim and the posterior inferior rim. This is the assessment in the subcostal fourth chamber view, where you can see part of the SVC rim and the mitral rim, part of it. This is an assessment from the fourth chamber view, where you can see it is from the this is a mitral rim and the superior rim, and this is an assessment of from the subcostal view proper, where the IVC rim in this particular case is almost absent and the SVC rim is there. So we went for a device closure in this case, though it was slightly risky, and thereafter the device was put here. This is the device where you can see it's put in position. So after the device placement, what we have to see is whether there is an impingement on the mitral valve, whether there is an impingement on the tricuspid valve, whether there is inflow gradient producing, whether and this is the short axis view, where you can see that whether the device is hugging the aorta and it's in the retroaortic rim is inside, the posterior inferior rim is totally inside, and only after the echocardiographer gives a nod that the device is safe and can be released, can the operator release the device to the satisfaction. So this is a dextrocardia ASD. This was a special case where the whole scenario was slightly topsy-turvy. You can see the apex of the heart is pointing towards the right. So what we did is we did a TE, transesophageal echocardiogram, and this is a transesophageal echocardiogram showing the ASD flowing left to right. So in this case, we did the dextrocardia ASD was done under TE and transthoracic guidance. You can see this is the ASD, which is a mirrored image. And after the device has been put, this was the assessment of the 4-chamber view. And after the device was deployed, this is the device which is in a dextrocardiositis inversus position. And we saw we had taken all the views and the device was perfectly in place, not obstructing the SBC or IVC, not obstructing any of the pulmonary veins, and not obstructing anything. This is a special ASD, which was put in it is a very few case reports in the whole world. Ours was the 4th case report. This is a coronary sinus ASD, which is almost similar to an unroofed coronary sinus. As you can see, there's a gap in the coronary sinus here, and we decided to close this one. As you can see, the flow is from the left atrium through the coronary sinus into the right atrium, and the defect was almost about 12 millimeters. Henceforward, this is the device in position. If we did not know that the device has been put on the roof of the coronary sinus, someone would report it as an ASD device which has been dislodged. But this was a 4th case report in the whole world. This was a coronary sinus ASD post-device echocardiogram, and the device is perfectly in place, closing the ASD. And this was the post-device echocardiogram. This is a 3D echocardiogram showing that there was no obstruction of the coronary sinus or any of the pulmonary veins. And this is a CT angiogram which showed that there has been ultimate closure. This is a device closure of the pulmonary VSD. This is a device closure of the pulmonary VSD with a septal leaflet of the tracheal valve aneurysm. And you can see that the device is in position, good position. This is a Garbody defect. This is a Garbody defect whereby the flow from the left ventricle is partially into the right ventricle and partially into the right atrium. And you can see the device defect has been measured here. And here you can see the flow from the left ventricle partially towards the right ventricle and mostly to the right atrium. So this defect was closed with this device. So this is an outlet muscular VSD. Usually, classically, we do not close outlet muscular VSDs with devices, but we have closed quite a few, almost 40 for the past about 10 years, and we are in the process of publication of the paper. This looks like a subpulmonary VSD, but there is a small bit of a tissue which we take advantage of, and this has been closed with an ADO2 device, which is 3x4 ADO2 device. This is an aortopulmonary window. As you can see, this is a pulmonary artery, this is the aorta, and this is the aortopulmonary window, which has been measured as 10.5 millimeters. And we have closed this one with the device. This is an aortopulmonary window device, which has been put here. The assessments which we should do here is whether there is an obstruction of the pulmonary artery, any obstruction of the aorta, and whether there is any obstruction of the branch pulmonary arteries as well. And most important, whether there is any impingement on the coronaries. So none of these were in this place. So hence we release the device. This is a pulmonary atresia where the duct dependent pulmonary circulation. As you can see here, the PDA is flowing into the PEA pulmonary artery, which has been duct dependent. Hence we went for a ductal stenting here. As you can see, there is no RV dependent coronary circulation. So the pulmonary valve was not perforated here, but it was the duct dependent pulmonary circulation, and we went forward. Hence, we went forward for a device stenting of the pulmonary artery. Here, you can see the stenting of the pulmonary artery has been done, and the flow is adequate. Here, you can see the stent in cross section, and here you can see the stent in the full section, where the stent is flowing well. So this is the assessment which should be done after a ductal stenting, where you can see that the duct is flowing well, and it might be so that on table there is thrombosis where we have to take immediate action. This is a Fontan fenestration. As you can see, this is a Fontan fenestration which is flowing bidirectionally. Hence, even if there is some amount of desaturation, since the Fontan pressure is high, we should not go for a Fontan fenestration closure at this moment. We should wait for some time, or we should give some agents which can lower the PA pressures and the Fontan pressures. This is a contrast echocardiogram. The reason I'm showing here, this child presented with dysfunction and cyanosis, and we did a contrast echocardiogram here, and you can see that the bubbles are coming inside the left atrium and the left ventricle within about 3 to 4 beats. Hence, there is some arteriovenous fistula, pulmonary AV fistula. When with the resultant cyanosis, there has been long-term cyanosis, so that there is some amount of dysfunction. Thereafter, we went forward with a CT angio, which showed that there is a PAVM which was closed with the device. There is a coronary cameral fistula.
Banerjee, sorry to jut in. You will have just 1 more minute. Please.
Yes, sir. I mean, this is a coronary cameral fistula, whereby the defect has been arising from the coronary artery and is flowing inside the right ventricle. You can see here as well, this is a coronary cameral fistula which was later closed with the device. So these are all the examples which we have put down. For the modern ones, we have an LA appendage closure with a Watchman device, for the TE assessment for mitral clip, and DECO assessment for LVADs. As you can see, the LVAD cannula is here. So these are the very dependency where we can do the device closures or these things with the device. This was a horrible thing which we had, which we eventually saw. This one is a device dislodgement, and this was a VSD device embolization, which we had luckily or unluckily, which we recorded on echocardiogram. And this is the last slide where you can see a live echo, where we were unlucky to see that the device dislodged while the echocardiogram was done. This usually helps us in assessment, and obviously the importance of an echocardiogram pre and post device or pre and post intervention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Banerjee, for that excellent case series. And as we know, it has a place in structural intervention. How much have you saved your fluoro time by using these? Any idea?
Yes, sir. The general fluoro time, for example, if we have ADO2 device closure, the total duration of the procedure is around 3 to 5 minutes if everything is okay. So even then, we have an echocardiogram ready, the echo machine ready, and the fluoro time has been reduced from approximately 10 to 12 minutes to approximately about 5 or 6 minutes time.
Dr. Hazra, Dr. Amal Khan, you're around. We can have just one more question to Dr. Amitabh, and then we can go to the next case. Are you around? Thank you, then, Amitabh, and may I have
Thank you, sir.
to invite Shanmuga Sundaram, who will be talking about the non-invasive approach to hemodynamic monitoring.
Good evening, everybody. This talk is more likely to be useful for critical care cardiologists and anesthesiologists, I suppose. Where do we need hemodynamic monitoring? Shock, acute heart failure, acute, high-risk ACS, people who are on mechanical circulatory support, high-risk surgery, and high-risk delivery. What do we try to get out of monitoring? You profile the hemodynamics, you choose the appropriate drugs or device, you assess the response to the intervention, and also for prognostication, it is going to be useful. PA catheter is the gold standard for hemodynamic monitoring, but the problem is, it's an invasive affair. Studies have quoted increased mortality or at least lack of outcome benefit. So we need a non-invasive hemodynamic monitoring for people who are ill. Before we get to know the techniques of non-invasive hemodynamic monitoring, I would like you to focus on two important physiological principles. It is not the oxygen saturation that is important, it is the oxygen delivery to the tissues that is important. And second thing is, it is the blood flow or the cardiac output that is more important than just the arterial pressure. Clinical methods, okay, when they are seen, it will be helpful, but negative predictive value is low. So we need hemodynamic monitors quite often. Non-invasive hemodynamic monitoring can be divided into minimally invasive and totally non-invasive. Minimally invasive techniques quite often use the pulse contour analysis. Pressure data is converted into flow data. Different algorithms, systolic portion, or the entire cardiac cycle, or the waveform is converted into sine waveform, and you get the stroke volume, and then cardiac output is calculated. The principle is the pulse pressure is proportional to the stroke volume. The next method is, look at the pulse wave transit time taken for the pulse to reach the finger. A simple pulse oximeter can give you the time. Transit time is inversely related to the stroke volume. So you have a formula to calculate the stroke volume and then cardiac output. This is a transpulmonary system. thermodilution system. We have a central vein catheter and a femoral arterial catheter anyway for a sick patient in ICU. We inject the cold saline into the central vein, and the femoral artery catheter senses the temperature difference, and you get the cardiac output out of it. And this is a little more complicated method, partial carbon dioxide rebreathing technique, where intermittently the patient is allowed to go into partial rebreathing, and with a complex and calculative methods, you arrive at cardiac output. Instead of oxygen being used in Fick principle, here we use carbon dioxide. Instead of puncturing the artery to get the arterial oxygen saturation, we get it from end-tidal PCO2. Esophageal Doppler is much more simpler to understand. A flexible catheter which carries the transducer. You have the pulse wave, the Doppler waveform. You have the descending aorta diameter. You calculate the stroke volume out of it. Totally non-invasive techniques are, one is FinaPress, which is generally used for continuous BP monitoring. Here also, the pressure waveform in the cuff can be converted into the flow data. Then comes bioimpedance. You apply current with one set of electrodes. You calculate or receive the voltage with another set of electrodes, and the impedance offered to the current is calculated as the stroke volume in the aorta. This presumes that heart is electrically isolated. Here also you can transfer the flow data and pressure data into flow data. Then comes much more easier device, ultrasound, standalone Doppler, keep it in the suprasternal notch, and then you have the Doppler waveform, calculate the stroke volume and then cardiac output. But the problem is none of the non-invasive parameters are going to be very accurate. Meta-analysis, the percentage error is as much as 47%, less than 30% is supposed to be acceptable. The more familiar tool, echo, is helpful to periodically evaluate the LV function, filling pressures, pulmonary artery pressure, and in the case of hypotension and shock, calculate LV outflow VTI, from which you can calculate cardiac output, etc. But much more important usage of echo is get to know whether somebody with hypotension will be fluid responsive or requires a vasopressor support. A small LV, hyperdynamic, kissing papillary muscles tells you that he is fluid responsive. In contrast, type 3 diastolic dysfunction, restrictive pattern tells you that he needs afterload reduction. A dynamic LV outflow obstruction in the absence of other causes should also tell you that he is fluid responsive. Then the dynamic variation of LV stroke volume, if the variation of VTI, LVOT is more than 14%, he is going to be a fluid responder. Then comes the much more easier method. Look at the IVC dimension in inspiration and expiration. Different methods of calculating the IVC distensibility in ventilated patients as well as in spontaneously breathing patient. You should know which method, the numerator and the denominator should be understood carefully. Passive leg raising, it can increase the blood shift of about 300 ml into the intrinsic compartment. The stroke volume should increase by more than 10% to tell that he is fluid responsive. But in spite of so many non-invasive hemodynamic monitors being available, we should accept that none of them are very accurate. We need to change over to hemodynamic monitoring whenever the patient becomes sick. Remember, whatever method you use, cardiac output is only estimated, not measured. You have to combine all the data, integrate with the patient illness to arrive at a conclusion. Directional changes are more important than single values, and continuous monitoring is better than single readings, because hemodynamics is very dynamic. But most important thing is it is you who is important, not the device. No hemodynamic monitoring can improve the outlook by itself. You should interpret the values properly and adopt the appropriate treatment methodologies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shanmugasundaram, for That excellent overview and finishing in time. Excellent. As you rightly said, one of the major handicap is, especially cardiac output stroke volume, is the presence of a normal LVOT and the absence of an AR. So many a time, the aortic ring diameter is the key point, and there could be individual variability in that. Was there any significant validation of these indices?
I just showed a meta-analysis, the percentage of error is quite, variable. I think none of them has proven to be very accurate.
If you are able to pick just one, will you go for the IVC rather than the cardiac output?
I'm more comfortable with, LVOT VTI, very simple parameter.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Is there any of my colleagues around? Anirudh, are you around? I mean, thank you, Shanmugha for the day.
Sir, I am not in the chairman list. Sir, you go and continue. I think nobody is.
Okay, it's okay. It's okay. I have the pleasure of inviting Dr. Roxy Senior for the important session on the role of stress echo in valvular heart disease. Over to you, sir. In the slide sorter mode. Are you still muted? We can't hear you, sir. Your slides are visible in the slide sorter mode, but we can't hear you.
If you share the slides again, probably then you'll be able to go into the.
Is there any technical person around, Anirudh? Otherwise, we can request Professor Manuran to have the session, and then Dr. Roxy can come later if there is any glitches.
I think so, sir. We can move on to the next one.
He's trying to share his slides once again, looks like.
Okay, we'll just wait.
Dr. Roxy, can you hear us?
I think he's out of Zoom.
Can somebody of your technical team contact him, tell him that he can wait for 10 minutes and then.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you. We can hear you.
Then I'm
Share
here.
your screen, sir. Share your screen.
Okay, so let me. No, I had a slight problem with my computer. Sorry about that.
But I can't see you.
You can see me now?
Now we can see you.
Yeah.
And you can hear me?
Now, yeah.
Okay.
Now share your screen.
Okay, let's share the screen. Okay, right.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Now the slides from fine. Absolutely fine.
Working. So, right.
Please
So
go
my
on.
talk is on stress echo and valve disease. Obviously, I've got 8 minutes. So I'm just going to present 2 cases, both illustrating sometimes the problems with the guidelines or the problem with how to assess certain valve disease. So let's start off with the first case. So this is a 77-year-old female who was incidentally found to have a murmur, but she's completely asymptomatic. And on echo, her mean gradient was 46 millimeter of mercury with a peak velocity of 4.5 meters per second across the aortic valve, and the aortic valve area was 0.6 centimeters square. So essentially severe aortic valve stenosis with a normal LV ejection fraction of 61% and a normal BNP. Now, according to the very recent guidelines published just early this year or maybe late last year, if you look at this group of patients who have severe aortic stenosis, but doesn't have any symptoms, what it says is if the ejection fraction is less than 50%, then they should go for intervention, and this is class 1 indication. Or if the patient has other reasons for going for cardiac surgery, then the valve should be tackled at that point. Or if the Vmax is more than 5 meters per second, meaning it's a critical aortic stenosis, or if the BNP is 3 times normal, or if there's a rapid progression, but remember this case has presented for the first time, so we don't know about the progression, or if the patient is a very low surgical risk, but the patient is 77-year-old, asymptomatic. So how do we deal with this patient? Now, one criteria is, according to this guideline, should perform exercise tests, not exercise echo, not stress echo, but exercise test, where you look at drop in blood pressure or you unmask symptoms, or rather reduction in exercise capacity. So now, we did a treadmill exercise. As you can see, the patient managed 4 minutes on Bruce protocol, 5 minutes with very mild symptom. There was no hypertension, no arrhythmia, or significant STT changes. So according to the guideline, we stop and follow the patient up. However, we have been doing stress echo in all these patients. So we image this patient, obviously. And when we image this patient, you will see the values that we obtained. So at rest, the stroke volume was about 81 ml. At rest, the mean gradient was 46, as I have stated. At peak exercise, the mean gradient went up to 56, which is fine, it went up. But if you look at the stroke volume, that has dropped remarkably to 48 ml, meaning half of what the stroke volume is. Now, we always do a quad screen on these patients. So this is what the quad screen showed. So if you look at the quad screen, you'll see on the left is rest, on the right is stress, apical 4-chamber at the top, 3-chamber view at the bottom. The first thing you observe is the LV is now dilated. And the next thing that you observe is that there is regional wall thickening abnormality involving the mid-septum, inferior septum, the whole of the apex extending to the anterior lateral wall. And on the 3-chamber, you can see the septum and the apex is akinetic. And also there's a reduction of wall thickening in the inferior lateral wall. So according to this patient has got LAD and non-LAD disease, intralateral, almost like a left main disease, really, because the LV is also dilated. So this patient underwent an angiography. And if you look at the angiography, it's quite clear what the patient has. Is you see the very, calcified valve there. And also you see a very tight proximal LAD lesion, a tight proximal left circumflex lesion. So it's a left main equivalent lesion with severe aortic stenosis. So this patient then underwent coronary artery bypass grafting. The patient incidentally also has RCA disease. So essentially 3-vessel disease with aortic valve stenosis. And this patient underwent coronary artery bypass grafting with aortic valve replacement. So the take-home message here is, despite the guideline, you must always look at the LV when you do a stress testing, and you must do a stress echo. Otherwise, you will miss such patients. Now, this patient was minimally symptomatic, but there's no question the patient was going to get into trouble very soon, because first of all, the LV dilated on exercise. So ejection fraction has dropped to less than 50%. Let's put it this way. So that is another class 1 indication for this patient to have a valve intervention. And secondly, the patient has severe 3-vessel disease, and therefore this patient needs, if anything, the 3-vessel to be tackled and the valve to be replaced, which again becomes a class 1 indication. So from on the one hand, we would have allowed the patient to be just observed if we had just followed what the guideline has said, but now you can see it has made a big change in how we approach this patient. So this is my first example. Now, second is another patient who has got mitral regurgitation due to mitral valve prolapse and has got mild MR, but the patient is symptomatic. So according to guidelines, you need to know why the patient is symptomatic. And therefore, we went on to perform a stress echo. But before that, this is how the valve and the LV looks. The LV looks, the ejection fraction is within normal range. The mitral, as you can see, by leaflet mitral valve prolapse, very myxomatous valve, it's a Barlow's valve. And you can see, mitral regurgitation more curling around into the anterolateral part of the left atrium, very eccentric jet. So this patient, so the guideline is to assess effective regurgitant orifice areas, the regurgitant volume, and the regurgitant fraction. So here's the ERO, mitral regurgitation, effective regurgitant orifice area, 0.29 centimeters square. It's not severe. And the regurgitant volume is 37 ml, so it's not severe. So, but the patient is symptomatic, and the baseline systolic blood pulmonary artery pressure was only 27. So the patient proceeded to stress echo. Why? Because we know that mitral valve prolapse with moderate MR may become severe as the volume of the left ventricle goes down, because at that point, the mitral valve cannot be contained. That bulky mitral valve cannot be contained in the left ventricle, and it prolapses into the left atrium, and it can and the MR can become severe. And also it can unmask the effect of LA and LV compliance. So decreased compliance will give rise to increased pulmonary artery pressure, and that is also an indication for valve intervention. And finally, of course, there could be a disparity between a closing and a tethering forces. So all these are uncovered during exercise. So the patient went on to have a bike exercise, and you can see now the PISA, the proximal isovelocity radius is 1, and the ERO calculated was 0.29. The MR volume increased to 37, and here is actually the calculation, and the pulmonary pressure rose to 38. And as I've said, we always look at wall thickening, and here you can see the patient had a very good contractile reserve in that the ejection fraction went up to about 69%. So good contractile reserve, and this is the summary of this patient. So it's clear cut that despite symptom, the symptom is not because of severe mitral regurgitation, but could be due to some other reasons, because the MR severity hasn't changed, the pulmonary artery pressure did not go up, the ejection fraction went up very well, meaning the patient had good contractile reserve, and there was no regional wall motion abnormality, which suggests that the patient does not have any coronary artery disease, or rather any ischemia. The patient may have coronary artery disease, but doesn't have ischemia. Now, this is another example of a same type of patient, mitral valve prolapse, moderate MR, rest, shortness of breath, again, similar bileaflet prolapse. So this is now the patient underwent bike exercise. And now you see that at rest, now this patient had an ERO of 0.34 with a MR volume of, or rather regurgitant volume of 28. But on exercise, you can see the ERO has gone up to 0.44. You can see the proximal, the PISA has gone up to 1.1, and therefore ERO has gone up to 0.44, and the regurgitant volume is now 71 ml. So this patient clearly, according to the EROA, has got severe MR, right? But if you look at the LV inflow, so this is at rest, and this is during stress, it does not suggest severe MR, because actually really nothing has changed very much. Okay, so how are we going to interpret this stress echocardiogram? Now, if you look at it carefully, what you see here is this patient has got mid to late systolic MR. On stress, the patient continues to have mid to late systolic MR. In fact, the way it was drawn, you can see how it was drawn. The VTI is overestimated because it took the whole systolic phase, and that's why the MR volume has gone up to 71, because you multiply VTI with ERO, and that's how you get the regurgitant volume. But the ERO is still 0.44, it's still raised. So why is it raised? It's raised because the PISA has gone up, that's why it's raised. But remember, this ERO is related to pan-systolic mitral regurgitation. So it is measured at a point, but this does not represent the whole of systole. So it's at a point. And if you look at it, it's only at this point that is giving rise to mitral regurgitation. So if you multiply this regurgitant VTI with EROA, it will be half. The regurgitant volume will be half of 71, it will be 35. And this is corroborated by the fact that mitral inflow really did not change very much. So the point of this, the take-home message for this is, you must look at the duration of mitral regurgitation in mitral valve prolapse. If it continues to be mid to late systolic MR, even if the ERO goes up, it is unlikely to be severe. And you should take help of other parameters like E velocity, which we did. And also you can look at mitral inflow VTI divided by LVOT VTI. That gives you an estimate of regurgitant fraction by another means, by left ventricular volume means. And if it is less than 0.4, then it is unlikely to be severe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Roxy, for giving us two excellent cases, and also telling us about the fallacies sometimes it may occur. Do you use it for post-operative assessment and prognostication?
You mean for doing stress?
Stress echo?
Not
or only for the decision making of early surgical decision?
No, so after the operation, you know, we reevaluate the patient. If the patient remains well, asymptomatic, and if the MR, if the operation is clearly good with mild or minimal residual MR, no, we don't provoke, not after the operation, but obviously intraoperatively, there are, you know, one should be careful that that the mitral valve repair has been done well and there's no SAM occurring. So that's a different issue. So not, you know, post-operative as it were.
First case, I'm Dr. Hajra here. The first case, if you have done the CT angio, just a CT angio, and if you have revealed that he's got triple vessel disease along with severe aortic stenosis, straight away you can send them for valve replacement. I agree, a surgical valve is preferably younger one. And second one, the second case, if you go for the Philips glass view or the newer torch view, something like illumination views, do you think that would assess the mitral degenerations better than the conventional imaging?
Okay, so the first question regarding doing CT, I mean, why should I just go and do a CT? You know, this patient's got severe aortic stenosis. So we need to actually be sure that this severe aortic stenosis is something that is not going to cause the patient a problem. So that was because that is in front of your eyes, severe aortic stenosis. So that's why we did the stress echo, to uncover symptoms and uncover, you know, any instability because of severe aortic stenosis. So that's what I would do, because if you do a CT, and especially in a 77-year-old lady, you will see calcification, right? And when you see calcification, it may not be, as I've said, the patient probably has coronary stenosis or rather coronary artery disease, but it may not be stenotic. So I will not do anything. If I do a CT, I will see calcification, but then I need proof that this is ischemic. So I would continue to do either, you know, CT FFR, which, you know, people are doing now, or do another stress echo. So that's why we went for stress echo, to uncover ischemia and to look at
And
how
stress
the,
echo is always a class 1 indication.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Roxy, for your valuable information. May I have the pleasure of inviting Professor Manyuran, who will be talking about how relevant is the right ventricular function in
Okay,
left-sided
brilliant.
heart disease. Thank you. Azra, you're going to take over from now, okay?
Dr. Anil Mishra had one question. Anyway, we can address it on.
Am I audible?
Slides are visible. Slides are visible. You are audible.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. Right ventricular function in left-sided disease. Is it relevant? The right ventricular function assessment by echocardiography is one of the very important assessments that you have to do in the LV disease. RV is a neglected ventricle. That is because LV, being the systemic ventricle, received all attention. RV imaging is more difficult. Newer techniques have made more RV function assessment easier and possible. Prognostic significance of RV function in various disease states is better understood. This is a number of investigations which are echocardiographic assessments of RV function. Starting from visual assessment, you can go up to RV free wall longitudinal strain. But you need not do all investigations in all patients. Basic investigations include visual assessment, TR velocity, and TAPSE. On visual assessment, if the RV is dilated in apical four-chamber view, normally RV is only 2/3 the size of the LV in the apical four-chamber view. If it is more than that, unless there is a volume overload condition like atrial septal defect, it indicates RV dysfunction. In patients with a D-shaped LV, indicates significant pulmonary arterial hypertension. All patients with a TR should have a TR velocity assessment, which indicates a peak systolic pressure of the peak systolic pressure in the RV. And TAPSE is a very simple but very reliable investigation to assess the RV function. Any value less than 17 millimeters indicate RV dysfunction. When these investigations are not enough, we can go further. These include looking at the IVC. If the IVC is not collapsing, then it indicates elevated RA pressure. And you can look at the systolic exertion velocity. If it is less than 10 centimeters per second, that indicates RV dysfunction. Another easy measurement which could be done is the fractional area change. Any fractional area change of less than 35% indicate RV dysfunction. You can further go ahead with RV evaluation, which include RV ejection fraction and RV longitudinal strain of the RV free wall. Now let us look at what is the relevance of RV function in left-sided disease. RV heart failure with a reduced ejection fraction. Studies have shown that those patients with a normal RV function, ejection fraction more than 38%, have freedom from hospital admissions, and these patients have a longer event-free survival, which is statistically significant. When we look at patients with heart failure and look at their survival, two important deciding factors are high pulmonary artery pressure and low right ventricular ejection fraction. They have a very bad prognosis compared to patients with normal pulmonary artery pressure and preserved RV ejection fraction. Let's look at what happens to patients with preserved heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. They also do bad, especially when they have poor LV function as assessed by the fractional area change, less than 35%. It is statistically highly significant. Again, TAPSE in these patients have been shown to be a parameter which can assess the prognosis, and also those patients with severe tricuspid valve regurgitation also do bad over a period of time. Dilated cardiomyopathy patients, 20% of patients of dilated cardiomyopathy have RV dysfunction. A very interesting observation that those patients with RV dysfunction, when they were treated, and if they showed improvement and they have got a good prognosis, similar to those patients without RV dysfunction. But those patients with persistent RV dysfunction, or patients who are developing RV dysfunction, they did bad. So RV dysfunction is an extremely important parameter to assess the prognosis in patients with dilated cardiomyopathy. More and more longitudinal strain is being made use of to assess the RV function. The RV strain of positive of minus 14.8 indicate poor prognosis in patients with preserved ejection fraction, heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. And if you look at the various parameters to assess the prognosis, the clinical features with LV ejection fraction and RV strain, they form the best index to assess the prognosis of patients with preserved ejection fraction and RV failure. When it comes to myocardial infarction patients, when they are associated with RV dysfunction, they have a bad prognosis. In those patients who have undergone primary PCI, 3 parameters, RV fractional area change, TAPSE, and RV strain, all indicated if there is a RV dysfunction, they indicated poor prognosis. Aortic stenosis patients, RV dysfunction was detected in 24% of patients with aortic stenosis out of 200 patients studied. Those patients with biventricular dysfunction, as evidenced by TAPSE less than 17 millimeters and LV ejection fraction less than 50%, they were the strongest predictors of poor prognosis. These patients with LV ejection fraction less than 50%, TAPSE more than 17% had bad prognosis. But all the other patients where there was at least one ventricle is normal, LV or RV, or both ventricles are normal, have a good prognosis. There is an interesting observation in patients with low flow, low grade, severe aortic stenosis. Patients with RV dysfunction did bad. But more interesting is that in these patients with RV dysfunction, even after aortic valve replacement, these patients behaved very bad. But in those patients with no RV dysfunction, even without aortic valve replacement, they did extremely well. So RV dysfunction becomes a very important parameter to assess the prognosis of patients with low flow, low gradient, severe aortic stenosis, because these patients, even after aortic valve replacement, have got a bad prognosis. Mitral valve disease, patients with mitral valve disease, if they are associated with biventricular impairment, they have got a bad prognosis. Even after these patients have undergone mitral valve repair, if they have a poor RV function, they do bad. Let us look at cardiac toxicity of anti-mitotic drugs. When the RV is involved in these patients who are on anti-mitotic drugs, it has been shown that they have got a bad prognosis. LV-AD as a destination treatment. The patients with LV-AD with destination treatment with poor LV dysfunction have higher risk of RV failure and poor quality of life post LV-AD. So what should we do in these patients? Those patients with tricuspid regurgitation and RV dysfunction are candidates for tricuspid valve repair or tricuspid valve replacement when these patients undergo intervention on the left side, especially aortic valve replacement or mitral valve surgery. All these patients should undergo a tricuspid valve intervention if the prognosis has to improve. So friends, what is the take-home message? RV function assessment is important in left-sided disease. It is very often overlooked. Each echo examination should have at least TAPSE and pulmonary artery pressure assessment. Right ventricular dysfunction may constitute a common final pathway in the progression of heart failure. RV dysfunction is a sensitive indicator of impending decompensation and poor prognosis. RV dysfunction with elevated pulmonary artery pressure predicts poor outcome. Patients with RV dysfunction and tricuspid regurgitation need intervention. RV function assessment should become part of every routine echo examination in patients with left-sided disease. I thank Arindada for giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for that excellent lecture, stressing the importance of assessment of the right ventricular function. Dr. Hasra, are you there?
Yeah, I'm there. I'm from the very beginning. So,
Okay.
Professor, nice talk. This is also important nowadays in trick valve, bicable implantation. You have to have TAPC more than 15, the BUA more than 25, and the PS systolic pressure less than 60. And you have rightly mentioned the LVAD is one entity where this is very, very important for the liver function. So my question to you, sir, if you have very acute insult like COVID or acute myocardial infarction, pulmonary embolism, both the ventricle can go for remodeling. So which one gets faster? I mean, rapid remodeling, RV or LV, and which one gets faster recovery?
Well, in a patient with pulmonary embolism, it is actually the RV which develops remodeling first. And also, as the pulmonary embolism treatment is effective, they also recover faster.
Sir, what will be the, you have highlighted the importance of combination of pulmonary hypertension and RV dysfunction causing the maximum mortality. How are these patients developing RV dysfunction in absence of significant pulmonary hypertension?
Maybe because the heart is in seizure. So to some extent, when there is an involvement of the LV, the RV can also get involved. And also the RV function can be impaired because the intraventricular septum is shared by both the right ventricle and the left ventricle. And some of these patients with poor LV function can have a coronary ischemia, and that also can give rise to RV dysfunction. But I fully agree with you that almost all patients with LV dysfunction progressively develop pulmonary arterial hypertension, mostly less than 60 millimeters of mercury, and they progressively go in for RV failure. And once they start developing RV failure, they develop tricuspid regurgitation, and that further aggravates RV failure.
Thank you, sir. The last slide carries the maximum meaning. Try to assess the right ventricular function in every echo that you do. Thank you. So we have the last presentation by Shantanu Gupta, and he'll be talking about the echo-guided bedside invasive procedure. Dr. Shantanu, please.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Mohanan. Now, I thought that we have already had a echo-guided invasive procedure thing discussed by Dr. Amitava. And I am taking a consent from Dr. Dey that there is something which is the need of the hour. And I would like to spend around 5 to 6 minutes on lung ultrasound, which has not been discussed in this webinar. And it is a very important topic. I know I am the last batsman, and I think I should make an impact, maybe strike a 6 and 4 or something. So I'm going to talk something little bit about lung ultrasound to make it very easy so that we all as cardiologists or internists start doing it. So lung ultrasound has got certain amount of interest in the last 2-3 years because of a lot of critical care patients and COVID and everything. So there are 3 probes which we have in an echo machine or ultrasound machine, which is the linear probe, curvilinear probe, and the phase wherever the echo probe. So the linear probe is a high frequency, low penetration probe, and it has a great image quality and with a bigger footprint. So it is mostly useful for vascular images. While the abdominal probe or the curvilinear probe has a frequency around 2.5 to 5 megahertz, higher penetration, again a big footprint, and is mostly used in abdominal ultrasound. But this is one of the best probes which you should use for an ultrasound, because lung ultrasound, because you're having a bigger footprint. But if you don't have it, if you have an isolated echo machine and with an echo probe, you still can use it for doing a lung ultrasound because the frequency is more or less similar and it has a higher penetration. But the only disadvantage it has a smaller footprint. Now there are 8 zones of lung ultrasound which has been defined anteriorly, and most of these patients are in the ICU. So you start scanning them from the anterior. So you draw a line in the parasternal border, the anterior axial line, divide it as 1, 2, 3, 4. This is on one side, and the other side will be 5, 6, 7, 8. So you have 8 zones. So whenever you're reporting, you should always try to tell that at these zones, these are the findings. Now, the components of lung ultrasound involves assessment of pleura, the lung parenchyma, and the diaphragm. Pleura, you look at the morphology, whether there is a sliding. It is a very important term, sliding of pleura, which is a normal finding. Is there any evidence of effusion? You also look at the lung parenchyma, looking at the aeration, and we can diagnose multiple problems, pneumothorax, edema, ARDS, effusion, and the volume status. Now, normally, the lung ultrasound shows a pleura which is visualized as a hyperechoic horizontal line, and there is a sliding motion with respiratophysics. So with respiration, the pleura slides, and you get a normal A lines, which are nothing but a hyperechoic horizontal lines. These are all straight lines. So A lines along with sliding is a normal thing, and this is how it looks. I will show it to you. This is a normal pleural sliding. As you can see, the pleura is sliding, and these are all horizontal lines. These are horizontal lines. So this is a normal aerated lung. There is a bright pleural sliding, which is moving with respiration. So normally the lung should look like this. So this is a pleural. You can also differentiate between a parietal pleura and the visceral pleura. And if you have evidence of a black colored black image, it is nothing but evidence of pneumothorax. So this is a parietal pleura without interfacing with the visceral pleura, and you have a bright black colored shadow, which is a pneumothorax. What we are interested in as a cardiologist is pulmonary edema. And in pulmonary edema, what happens is, let me go to the slide, is presence of B lines. B lines are nothing but artifacts, and this generally originate from the pleural line, move synchronously with lung sliding, and they are basically artifacts, and they are perpendicular. So you get longitudinal lines, and this obliterate the A lines, and they are basically generated due to high difference in the acoustic impedance, and multiple B lines indicates that there is some interstitial process which is going on. So this is how you start looking at. This is a normal A line, aerated lung with sliding. But if you get a pleural sliding with perpendicular bright lights, which are more or less are in longitudinal direction, you get the B lines. These are the B lines, and you quantify them on the various 8 zones, whether they are present or not. So this is nothing but an interstitial process indicating that there is evidence of fluid. So the A line has pleural sliding and aerated lung, and these are the B lines. And so this has been simplified by diagram. These are the lines which you see. Again, B lines, you can see the pleural sliding, and these are vertical lines which you can document at various places. So they have also quantified, if you start seeing more than 3 lines, it is significant. As you see, there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, almost 6 to 7 lines in this zone of the chest wall. So these are between A lines and B lines. As you can see, right anterior chest, this patient had B lines. The patient of STEMI, so this patient had evidence of pulmonary edema. So this can be done regularly, and it has been seen that B lines increase with the amount of the decreased aeration and the fluid inside the lungs. And as the B lines increases, there is more evidence of pulmonary edema, more evidence of water, more the B lines, more the amount of interstitial fluid a person has. And there are a lot of studies which have shown up that if you add on clinical to a lung ultrasound to X-ray, the sensitivity and specificity of diagnosing cardiogenic edema versus non-cardiogenic problem, the patient coming with breathlessness becomes very high. So clinically, if you're doubting before you have an NT-proBNP or other values, you can immediately put a probe and see whether this patient is having breathlessness because of cardiogenic problem or non-cardiogenic problem. And if you add up values of biomarker, the sensitivity and specificity even goes very high. So presence of B-line also has a prognosticate value, and this has been added to stress testing. And of course, Roxy is here. I don't know whether their group are adding up a lung ultrasound in stress echocardiography in various heart failure patients. I'm sure he will like to comment after this, but it does correlate with increasing E by E prime during stress test. And there are a lot of papers which have come up adding up this B lines in a stress echocardiography. So the ABCDE of stress echo has now added that you should have a regional wall motion abnormalities, you should have a B line assessment, you should have a E by E prime, coronary flow reserve, and of course heart rate reserve. So you can divide them into a dry heart versus a wet heart, depending upon the number of B lines you quantify in each zone. And it should be done regularly in patients who are suspecting a cardiogenic problem. Now, B lines can also be quantified whether there is a diffuse B line. So it involves all these segments. Mostly it starts from below because it is a dependent edema. But if you have a non-homogeneous pattern, then you are looking at something. If it is a focal pattern, or if it is a basal pattern, then you're looking mostly into an acute lung injury or ARDS or pulmonary fibrosis. And this acute lung injury, if it is mostly basal or in the outer component, goes more in favor of problems because of COVID. So there is a lot of research now going to use ultrasound, lung ultrasound for COVID-induced lung involvement, and whether this can be done on a regular basis. And I'm sure focal B lines indicates pneumonia, atelectasis, can also indicate some lung pathology like neoplasm or an infarct or a traumatic contusion. So let me summarize that you start imaging in a patient if you're suspecting at all the 8 quadrants. And as you can see, this is a classical pleural sliding. And if you have a normal aerated lung, you will only get A lines. But if you start looking at B lines, the B lines will be mostly longitudinal lines, and then you can identify patients of cardiac edema. So this is another patient, more information. This is a normal pleural sliding. But if there are irregularities in the pleural lining, then you can also identify consolidation, a subpleural consolidation, a pneumotic kind of paths. So let me try to wrap up and end here, because I want to make it very simple, that you should know what is the A line, what is pleural sliding, and what is B line, and all the 8 places where you have to identify and try to come out with a diagnosis at the bedside level. And these are the 8 things, 8 segments where we should start doing a lung ultrasound regularly. Thank you so much.